Okay, so Maria is going to be talking to us about dragons in Jane Austen time. Her talk is called "Of Course There Were Dragons, Dragons, Fantasy, and Jane Austen." If you haven't read her dragon series yet, I'm going to just throw in my 2 cents here and say that I really recommend it. I'm not personally a big fantasy reader. I could probably count on one hand the fantasy books I've read. But what I like about fantasy books in Jaff is that I'm so familiar with the world already that this added element just gives it that a little bit of extra oomph. And what I like specifically about Maria's books is that in that time period, women didn't really like have a lot of say in everything. So because there are dragons, it brings in this wonderful candor to the story that I really like seeing. So I hope you like them as much as I like them, and I will turn it over to Maria.
Well, thank you so much. I am so excited to see everybody here. I see a lot of familiar names in the participant list, and I am just tickled to be able to get to spend some time with you. I'd like to, since we're a fairly small group, I would love to just field questions and discussions. So while we're still fairly small, if you've got questions, I'd love to try to jump on them in real time. So you can put them in the Zoom chat or in the Facebook chat comments. I'm not Facebook, I'm sorry, I meant YouTube. It's too many technologies going on at once. I feel like I have been living on technology recently, and if it's not, 3 different apps on the cell phone, it's Zoom and YouTube and WebEx, and it's all starting to kind of run together in a blur. So, feel free to jump in with questions and comments. I was hoping that Benny Fife, who is the narrator for the Dragon books, was going to join us today. The plan was he was going to try to pop in, and if he does, I would love for him to chat a little bit about some of the interesting stuff in the process of narrating the books. I do see a question on reading the books in order, and the 4th book is a prequel to the first 3, but I kind of think it makes the most sense to read it as the 4th book, but you could read it first if you really wanted to. And the new Persuasion arc that will be coming out on the 9th can be read standalone from the first 4 or in order. It kind of, there's some flexibility there that makes it kind of fun. When I started on this series, I got a lot of funny looks because it's a little bit off the beaten path for Jaff. Last night we were talking about tropes in Jaff, and pretty much dragons were not one of the major tropes we found in Jaff. Oh, hi, Betty. It's great to see you. I see you just checked in. Jaff is not one of the major tropes that we see in, I'm sorry, let me try saying that again. I got distracted seeing Betty come on. Dragons are not one of the major tropes we see in Jaff, which, is kind of a shame because they're really fascinating and a great deal of fun. And I think everybody should add them to the mix. But it does kind of make them a little bit different from the beaten path. One of the reasons I think we don't think about dragons in Jane Austen is that she was really, really grounded in the world around her. And so she was very, very realistic in what she was portraying. She was portraying what she saw every day. And so kind of leaping off into a fantasy world seems a little bit off the beaten path. But at the same time, I think that there's a really good argument to be made that Brenda says, dragons are so much more fun than zombies. I think so, but I'll talk about this in a minute. The zombie movie actually kind of gave me the last piece of the puzzle of how to bring dragons into Austen's world. I'll talk about that in a minute. I see the question, how many more books do I anticipate? Well, depending on how well received the persuasion arc is, I have anywhere between 6 and 12 more potential plots scribbled in various forms in notes. So we could go on for a while, which I would love to do. I would really love to do, because I have so much fun with that. It's great to see you, Suzanne. Hey, Benny. Oh, Northanger Abbey. Yeah, I've talked with Ben about my Northanger Abbey plot, which is actually based in some of the myths of the Cornwall dragons, which we'll talk about in a minute. Yes, new plots based on Austen works, and a few that are tangential to some of the other works. They're not Austen plots, but they're Austen characters from the world that's been set up. Austen herself probably didn't read a lot of fantasy books, because really we didn't see fantasy coming up as a genre until the Victorian era. That's when most literature scholars mark the first true fantasy book having been written. So Austen wouldn't have read a lot of fantasy works. They simply weren't available. However, she would have been very, very aware of the mythology and those stories that were present. And when you start looking at the mythological histories in Britain, one thing that you see over and over and over again is the presence of dragon in British mythology. They're everywhere. I hadn't realized how prevalent they were till I started really looking into it. Just to name a few, there's the Lambton worm, which immediately jumped to my head as a Pride and Prejudice connection because of Lambton Village right outside of Pemberley. The dragon of Mortiford, which I'll talk about that myth in a minute, but that really informed the character of Elizabeth for me in a lot of ways. Then there's the dragon of Unsworth, the dragon of Wantley, the dragon of Longwitten, the dragon of Locksley Hill, the Bistern dragon, the worm of Linton, the Stour worm or wyvern, there goes several different ways, the Sockburn worm, Blue Ben, and the Lyminster Knucker are all dragon myths from the British Isles. So the dragon has a huge mythological presence. And what's more is these stories were passed down through oral tradition, both in spoken form and in ballad form, because for a long time, there was not a lot of literacy. So that's how stories passed down. In the 1600s, the lyrics of ballads would be published in broadsheets, and they were called broadside ballads in newspapers to preserve them for, and that ended up preserving it for multiple generations. So what all of that comes to mean is that Jane Austen herself was probably familiar with the dragon mythology that we can look back and see today. So I used all of this mythology to inform the stories and some of the characters in the beginning places. Benny asks if I might ever go back and look at Uther Pendragon and do a book completely on the origins of the Blue Order. I think that would be fun. I don't have a plot for that yet, but I'm certainly going to add that to my notes because I think that sounds like a whole lot of fun. I did use the myth of Uther Pendragon as a starting point for all of the mythology that I put into the book. King Arthur was the son of Uther Pendragon, and Uther Pendragon took the name Pendragon from a dragon-shaped comet that came as an omen in battle to him. And from that, I kind of did the author thing, which is starting to ask what if. If you know an author who starts asking what if, it's a very dangerous question because we get thinking. And when authors get thinking, all sorts of ideas get flying around and we end up with Jane Austen and dragons. The what if I got thinking of is, what if it wasn't really a comet, but it was an actual dragon, and it was called a comet to make it more acceptable to people because, you know, dragons are big and scary. And from there, I got to thinking, well, if there were dragons, how might dragons and people coexist? And out of that came the idea that, you know, dragons basically hid in plain sight. Only a few individuals would know that the dragons were there because they had a particular trait of hearing that allowed them to hear the dragon's voices, which were outside the range of normal human hearing. And that group then became the Blue Order, who were responsible for maintaining the peace between human and dragons. And that's kind of the premise. And from there, we move up through the centuries into Jane Austen's era. I'm trying to look at the group chat here to see if I have missed anything. I don't want to miss a question or some conversation here. Yeah, Lucy mentions that on YouTube, there's mentioned that a lot of classics are fancy. Certainly Shakespeare has fantastical elements. What I was referring to was the first fantasy novels were usually dated back into the mid 1800s, 1830-ish. So it's the novel form of fantasy that I was referring to that really wasn't prevalent in Austen's times, but fantasy stories were. So I think it entirely possible that fantasy would have been something that Austen could have explored had she had more time to write. I see a question about how many books in the Clinch series. Definitely 2, possibly 3. I'm still kind of kicking around the plot for the 3rd, but it's definitely 2, which brings us to the conclusion of what Austen wrote in Persuasion. But there may be a 3rd with some further adventures, particularly for Wentworth and the dragon. Now, I had mentioned the Beauty and the Beast, Joanna mentions as a fantasy. A lot of fairy tales really have fantastical elements. So again, Austen would have been familiar with these things. And so I don't think it's that much of a leap. I had mentioned one of the myths of the Dragon of Mortefort that was a starting place for me. I was reading through the dragon mythology in England, and I hit this particular tale and was just kind of gobsmacked, and I stared at it. It's the story of Maud and the Mortefort dragon, which was actually a wyvern, which is it's the 2-footed dragon with wings. It's one of the traditional dragon images. You have the 4-footed dragon with wings, which are drakes, and then the wyvern, which is the 2-footed dragon that has wings. And that's a wyvern, which anybody who's read the series will recognize the wyvern was the Longbourn families, the Bennett families dragon. So the story was Maud and the Mortefort dragon, the wyvern. And it was set in the Hertfordshire village of Mortefort. Now, Meryton was in Hertfordshire, not Hertfordshire, but you know, we're close. Mortefort, Meryton, that works in my head. Anyway, Maud finds this baby green wyvern while out walking and takes the baby back to become a pet. And she cuddles, and it's her pet dragon, and she's very, very close to her dragon. But most of the other villagers find it intolerable, and they try to get rid of the wyvern. But Maud, that's her best friend, and she protects it. And I thought about this story of this girl who loves a baby dragon and rescues them and understands them, and a grumpy wyvern that nobody can seem to get along with. And as I said, anybody who's read the first part of the Dragon books will recognize this is very much who Elizabeth was in terms of her relationship to the Wyvern and the Wyvern's relationship to everybody else. He was just grumpy and she was the only one who really understood him. So that's really where the story began. And as I was kind of thinking about all of how to make this work, I was watching, and it's kind of sad to admit, but I was watching Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, which my husband insisted that, that sounded like a fun romp. And well, who am I to disagree? He wants to watch Jane Austen with me. He's watched everything else, so we watched this one. And as I was watching it, the author in my brain is staring at this story, and it suddenly clicked in terms of story structure, how to weave the Austen story in with the dragon stories, because that's kind of what Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies did. It took the plot line of Pride and Prejudice and then wove in and around it the zombie plot. And so the whole structure there, I was just staring at it and I kind of had this aha moment of, oh, that's how it works. And so I really credit to Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, the final piece that made the whole story work and make sense. In the comments here, yeah, my favorite thing is when Doctor Who shows up as Mr. Collins in Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, and that seemed to make the whole thing make sense. When Doctor Who is there, and it's absolutely, of course, they're zombies. And that movie has the best proposal refusal scene of any of them out there, because it nails the emotional content in ways that none of the other adaptations do. So I really enjoy it for that. Excuse me for just a second here. One of the other things that I found so much fun in trying to build the world was looking for dragons to populate my world with. Because as I was thinking through the story, the problem with big dragons like wyverns and drakes, we think of the 20-foot tall fire-breathing dragon. They're a great deal of fun and all, but they're kind of difficult to hide in plain sight. It's kind of difficult to have a conversation with the dragon because you can't bring the dragon in the house. They're a little bit big to fit through the door. So I got to thinking, okay, how can we get more interaction with the dragons into the story, even though we've got these huge ones lurking that we can't, parade down the street because we're still trying to keep them in hiding. And as I looked more and more at the mythologies, both in England and throughout Europe and throughout the world, I mean, I have a few dragons that really originate in the Far East showing up. There were a lot of small dragons in mythology. Some of my favorites, I have little fairy dragons, which are little hummingbird, bird-sized dragons, which come out of Japanese mythology. In Japan, they're called Hiro, and I kind of Europeanized it to fairy dragon, but that's where that particular species of dragon came from, was out of Japanese mythology. And everybody loves the tassel worms. The tassel worms are kind of a cat dragon, and the front half is a cat and the back half is a serpent. Very much like the cockatrice, which is also out of European mythology, where you have the front half and legs of a large bird, a bird of prey, and the tail of a serpent. And the cockatrice is much more familiar to people. But the tassel worm I had never, ever heard of until I saw it in some alpine mythology. And I mean, it's a cat. It's a cat dragon. What's not to love about a cat dragon? And they're of a size that they can be companions with people and disguise themselves as cats, just like fairy dragons can disguise themselves as birds using something that I built into my story with persuasion. That is an ability the dragons have to, since they normally speak in a frequency that most people can't hear, they can use that voice to suggest, to give suggestions that people who can't hear them otherwise would take subconsciously, and thus persuade people that, oh, I'm a cat, not a tasselworm, or I'm a fairy dragon, not a tasselworm. You don't see me here, you don't even notice me. And so that's the mechanism by which they hide. So now I was able to have small dragons populate my world, and that expanded the possibilities tremendously. I saw a question about being influenced by Anne McCaffrey's fire lizards. I love Anne McCaffrey. I have been a Pern junkie for years. I absolutely fell in love with that series. And I loved being able to have the fire lizards close at hand because they didn't have to be in the dragon lair. And I wanted to be able to do something similar. Her fire lizards were very small dragons and were the genetic stock from which the big dragons came. And I wanted to try to not duplicate what she had done. Of course, it's very tempting when you do it so well. It's really tempting to fall into a trap of mimicking those ideas. So that's why I'm sorry, I'm looking at the chat here. Like when theaters would flash popcorn and soda signs. Yes, that's exactly how persuasion works. That's great. And that's how the dragons earn money to buy sheep. I love that. That is fantastic. But yeah, that's exactly how persuasion works. And so persuasion was a great book to do in the dragon universe because persuasion is such a theme with my dragons. But anyway, I didn't want to duplicate what Anne McCaffrey had done with her dragons. So that's where I really started doing a deep dive into mythologies to look at inspiration for dragons that already existed. So that way I could, keep from wandering into Anne McCaffrey's world, which has already been done perfectly. It doesn't need me to touch it. So that's really where the dragons came from and how they've been woven into Jane Austen's world. And the catchphrase, the log line for the series is, of course, there were dragons, because now they just seem to fit for me in Jane Austen's world. And I keep looking for hints of the dragons in her works. And they fit so perfectly with her stories that I think it's amazingly fun to see how they keep popping up and how their personalities become such a very interesting part of the world. Brenda said, do I find hints of dragons in Austen's work? I'll tell you a funny story about the persuasion theme books. And if any of you haven't read, George Wickham is named after a dragon slayer. Yes, St. George. That's a good one, Sarah. Going back to the persuasion book, if you haven't read The Dragons of Kalinch, I will warn you, this is a spoiler, so you may want to cover your ears for a moment, because this does spoil a little bit one of my favorite things in the book. A lot of times when I'm chewing on plots, I will grab my husband or one of my sons and we'll go walking, and 2 or 3 miles later, I'm just telling you, okay, I'm thinking about this, what do you think? And my guys aren't writers, but oh my gosh, they have outstanding imaginations, and sometimes they throw out just some of the best ideas. So as we were walking, I was telling my husband about what I wanted to do with persuasion, and he looks at me, and here's the spoiler, so blur it out if you don't want to hear. He looks at me and said, "Well, Lady Russell's a dragon. All she does is persuade throughout the whole story." So I looked at him, and I just stopped walking at that point. It's like, oh my gosh, this is brilliant. This is absolutely what's going on, because that is what Lady Russell does through the whole sequence of the book. Is her thing has been to persuade not just Anne, but her father, her whole family. So her whole existence is persuasion. And suddenly the whole book of Persuasion made sense, even from Austen's perspective. So that was one of the biggest ways I saw the dragons coming in to Jane Austen's plots. And I'll type in chat here. It's safe now. No more spoilers for a moment. Because I don't want to spoil the story, but that was so much fun seeing how that fit the story so well. One of the fun things, and Ben, I'm going to unmute you here so you can kind of join in the conversation. I want to introduce Benny Fife, who is the narrator. Okay, are you there, Ben?
I'm here, yep.
Okay, good. Some switched on my list here, and I all of a sudden lost you. I was afraid you disappeared. Ben is the narrator he's done the first 4 of the Dragon books. We've got the Dragons of Kalinch in the hopper right now that we're working on. And as soon as I finish the manuscript for Dragon Persuasion, Kalinch Dragon Persuasion, that will be sitting on his desk as well. So those 2 are happening. But he has been a partner in crime with me in bringing these guys to life. And I know those of you who've listened to the audiobooks have just been in awe of his talents in taking the dragons off the page and really breathing life and personality into them.
And I've loved doing it. It's been basically a dream come true for me. When I first saw it up for audition, I'm like, Jane Austen and dragons? Who wouldn't want to?
But they were definitely, I think for all the audiobooks that I've had done, these are probably the most challenging and the most really difficult books to do. There was one audition, because I had probably 62 auditions, and I'm not exaggerating. There were like 62 auditions for the book. And there was one of them that I will never forget, where the narrator tried to do Longbourn, and it sounded like Scrooge McDuck.
I can't do Scrooge.
Just as well, because I didn't really think that bit very well. But it did demonstrate to me how difficult these books would be to narrate well.
Well,
what are some of the challenges you found with them?
Some of the reviews and things, some people absolutely love the way I do dragons, and there's a few people, particularly with the way that I've done the fairy dragons, like April and whatever, really don't like that. And I'm okay with that, but it is something where, because of how we've decided to do it, I mean, I do the voices, but then I do various effects on top of it. The editing process is substantially longer than some of my other books are, because I'm adding in effects after the fact. Like with Longbourn, for example, and I do his voice as, I will eat anyone who comes between me and my keep, kind of thing. But then I take it and I put it at like, I slow it down so it's 95% of the speed of my normal voice. And whereas with the fairy dragons, like April, it's, I
I speak in this high pitched falsetto initially, and then I accelerate it by 30%.
And that creates the hummingbird effect. So and with Walker and whatever, there's variations in all of it. So, but I love doing it.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time talking about what the dragons are supposed to sound like. Baby Pemberley was a challenge. And I have to say, when I was initially writing these, I really hadn't thought about the whole aspect of doing audio. I just plunged in and kind of did whatever dragons came up and made sense in the story without giving any thought to how they would need to sound. So when Pemberley hatched, and all of a sudden we had a baby fire drake, which will grow up to be an enormous fire-breathing dragon. We kind of hit this question of, what does a baby fire-breathing dragon actually sound like? And it was an adventure trying to figure that out.
My favorite was your description of one of my initial attempts as Audrey 2. So
yes, I remember that. From Little Shop of Horrors, Audrey 2 was the man-eating plant in that musical. Because I was thinking about the musical version of it. And one of the first attempts at Baby Pemberley sounded like a man-eating plant. And then you asked me, what should she sound like? And oh man, I remember just stopping at that question thinking, that is a brilliant question. But I suddenly discovered that my vocabulary for trying to describe voices was sorely lacking. How do you describe a voice? It's high pitched, it's low pitched, it's fast, it's slow, it's childlike, it's male, it's female. And I'm starting to run out of descriptors for what it's supposed to sound like. So that made the process rather challenging. Finally, I think we settled on going back to some of the Land Before Time cartoons, which my kids watched when they were little. They were baby dinosaurs. And we started listening to the baby dinosaurs, trying to hear how those were put together to try to put together a voice for Baby Pemberley.
And that's where I started from. And it's something where, I hadn't watched Land Before Time since I was a little kid, but I watched some YouTube ones and whatever and went back and it was a good place to start from. So when I have a starting place, then I can, tweak it and do my own thing. And Maria's been great to work with me and say, no, that doesn't work. Or yeah, I really like this one. I've loved being part of the creative process in this whole thing.
The variety of dragon shapes and sizes, because one of the things that has set these dragons apart from what a lot of other dragon mythology or dragon stories that I've read have been is the variety of shape and size and configuration of these dragons, where Anne McCaffrey's dragons were all basically one kind of dragon in different sizes, from the fire lizards, and then the different colors of dragon, from the the little green ones to the gold queens. They were all basically the same configuration of dragon, the traditional winged fire-breathing dragon sort. We've got cat dragons and tassel worms and the more traditional four-legged dragons and the wyverns, and then we get into the worm type dragons, which are snake type dragons, and the feathered and winged serpents from like Quetzalcoatl from the Americas. So we've got even a bigger challenge trying to figure out how do those different types sound. And I see the question branching beyond Austen with some of the characters like Shindia from the Eastern Dragon Federation. That one was in Netherfield. You know, if I find the plot, I'm open to do it. I've literally got between 6 and 12 plots in note form right now. I've got Sense and Sensibility, Northanger Abbey, Mansfield Park. I haven't quite figured out Emma yet, but I'm close. So those are definitely there. And then I've got some tie-up plots for things that got opened up in the first series. And then my middle son, who is one of my plot buddies, bent on world domination. He's actually a political history buff. He's a lawyer, and so he loves that stuff. And he's been working with me on a huge plot arc that kind of starts off in the first book and will probably go over through 12 books and, you know, wrap up in the last 3. So he's plotting away for me. It's like, hold on a minute, kids, slow down. We'll see where all this goes.
See, bring in Victor Hugo.
Oh boy, that's another time period I have to research though. If I see the question, do all the books need to be read in order? Could be a companion book my sons would love. Yeah, some of the books do need to be read in order, like the 3 Pride and Prejudice books, because that's the 3-book arc in Pride and Prejudice. And it loosely follows where Austen broke her 3 volumes. And the Persuasion arc right now has 2 books, and I'm possibly kicking around a 3rd because, you know, Napoleon does escape Elba in 1815, and the book concludes at the end of 1814. So there's the potential that may go somewhere. And so those 3 would have to be read in order. But then there'll be some smaller books like The Introduction to Dragons, which was Elizabeth's backstory. With Sense and Sensibility and Northanger Abbey, those could probably be read separately. I'm not sure if those will be 1 or 2 book arcs. It kind of just depends on how the story evolves. But yeah, those would be able to be read separately. What I'm trying to do is make sure that the world is sufficiently brought out in each of the books that you could start in any one of Austen's books and it would make sufficient sense. And I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Hang on a second. And I'm also trying to use different mythologies, like the Northanger Abbey story. I'm really looking at the mythology of the Cornish dragons. Or is it Welsh? I have just blanked out. But it's Dueling Dragons is the working title. Northanger Dueling Dragons is the working title on that one. So I'm trying to stick with a lot of the mythology as I find it. One, because I like anchoring it in those things that Austen would have had exposure to and that she would have known. And 2, it's just some great story fodder to work with. Brenda's asking about a complete list of dragons as suggested above. Hang on just a minute. I need to see what that suggestion was. I do have an index for the series that if you subscribe to my newsletter, I have a dragon newsletter, and there is a free copy of that index to anybody who subscribes for it. And if you're interested, you can run by the website, which is Random Bits of Fascination. And along the sidebar, you'll see where you can subscribe to the newsletter. So you can get a copy of that index. I see a question from Ben about bringing in other mythological creatures, and oh, this could get out of control so fast. I'm not sure. I haven't thought about it yet. Thanks, Mike. I don't dare try to pronounce that name. that you put up there, but the classic Welsh dragon. DDRAIG. Ben, you want to try to pronounce that one? You're the vocal specialist.
I'm guessing, but I could be completely wrong. I think it's Idregoch.
Better than I could do. But yeah, that's a name for sure. So the index is out there, and I keep adding to it. In fact, as this world keeps evolving, each book brings in some new aspect of the Dragon Society. One of my rules in writing this is not to do the same thing twice, not to use the same plot problem or the same plot device twice, because then it gets really boring really fast. That's how series die out, is that they get stuck doing the same thing over and over again, which makes it great fun because I have to keep coming up with something new, which is also a little crazy making on the side. But the offshoot of that is trying to keep track of everything, because every book brings in new aspects of the Dragon Society and the Pendragon Accords, which are the set of agreements made between the human and dragon culture. And you can't cover all of that in one book, so it keeps getting added to and added to and added to. So I have a file of clippings from each story as I introduce new dragon characters or new situations. There are a couple of books which feature legal suits between humans and dragons, or dragons and dragons, and how those are handled and the rules that come up in the process, or even the procedures. I have all of that squirreled away to a file that I try to write to as I'm writing the book, and then at the final proofread stage, I grab stuff and dump it into that file. And right now we are pushing 200 pages in what writers call it a story Bible, which is really where you have all the descriptions of your worlds, your buildings, all of those things that you want to refer back to. I'm pushing the 200-page mark on that. So just trying to keep track of the world is starting to get a little bit crazy making. It is good fun though. I see a question about dragon antagonists. And that's what my middle son is trying to help me craft right now, is a rather complicated plot with not just one, but several dragon antagonists who threaten the Pendragon Accords and the peace of dragons in England. Brenda asks how old my kids are. My kids are, let's see, my youngest is turning 22 next month, and then I have a 25-year-old. He'll be turning 26 this year, and my oldest one is 29 right now, and he has 3 kids. The youngest is a newborn. She was born in, let's see, 3 weeks ago. And then there's a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. So my kids range from newborn to 30 in that sense. Thank you. It is interesting having a baby girl now. I have, my kids are all boys, and then I've got 2 grandsons, and then with the baby girl, it's like, oh, that's new. How did you get this one out? Ben asks about the evil dragon Napoleonic in nature. Quite possibly. We also may have dragons facing Napoleon yet. Yes, no hedgerows for me. This is true. So we may actually have a dragon conflict featuring Napoleon if the persuasion arc moves forward. I'm kicking that around with my political history son. I've got one son that does political history, and one son who works on a lot of the relational elements with dragons. So each one of my kids has a specialty in terms of plotting with me. So it's great fun. And we have had many wonderful hours just sitting around, knocking around these stories to me. Mike asks, how much of the original Austen plots do I feel I need to keep intact? I find it a fun challenge to try to weave in as much of Austen's work as I can. With Persuasion, I think I kept probably 95 to 97% of it intact. There were only, there was a little bit at the end that I had to change, the spoiler that I had to change, and then just a few other tidbits. It actually fit in really, really well with Austen's original piece. In Pride and Prejudice, after the, into the second book, we started having to deviate more and more from the original plot, but I tried to keep as much of it as I could, because I think that's part of the fun of this story. Mostly what I try to keep intact is Austen's work, although I use Austen's language whenever I can. I love to drop in Austen quotes. And one of my favorite ways to do it that does drive, as Benny noted, some reviewers crazy is I will put someone else's dialogue in someone else's mouth. And I think it's a lot of fun to do that. Some readers kind of lose their mind when I put Collins's words in Darcy's mouth or vice versa. But I like to use Austen's language when I can, just simply to keep referencing back to the work, because that's really a strong foundation in it. What is really funny, though, is more often than not, when some of my proofreaders have issues with some of the sentence structure, some of my language, 90% of the time, maybe a little bit more, it's actually Austen's quotes that they don't like how it's punctuated, or how the word order is used, or some of the wording choice. And I think that's just hilarious, because we'll get in, no, that's an Austen quote, go look. I got the question here, do I take the quotes and build around it, or is it more coincidental? It's hard to say sometimes, because certainly with Persuasion and with Pride and Prejudice, I know those really well. And they're always kind of in the subconscious anyway, so I don't think I intentionally work from those. But I think I'll probably be able to answer that question more as I get into some of the works that I'm not as familiar with. I mean, I have read and I know Northanger and Mansfield Park and Sense and Sensibility and Emma, but probably not to the same degree that I know Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion, because those are my favorites. I also have this secret desire to find some kind of dragon plot in Lady Susan, which was done in the movie Love and Friendship, which is actually, Love and Friendship was another piece of juvenilia that Austen wrote, but they used that title for the movie adaptation of Lady Susan. Yeah, Lady Susan could be a dragon. I thought about that, and I'm not sure how it works, but she's certainly got the personality for it. The first time I read Lady Susan, I just stared at it and I thought, this can't be Austen. This is a train wreck, and I should stop reading, but I can't drag myself away from it. It was just absolutely fascinating, and I would love to find some way to bring Lady Susan into this world as well, just because it's so much fun. The characters are so outlandish. Lady Susan is a novella that she wrote as part of her juvenilia. And it's unlike, in so many ways, it's unlike anything else Austen wrote, which I think makes it great fun, because it does show a side of Austen that we don't see in her more mature works. And I have a lot of fun with it. So I am chewing on how dragons were part of Lady Susan as well. That one I don't have as clear a bead on yet. Oh, Sanditon could be interesting. Dragons of the beach. Well, there are sea dragons. We definitely see sea dragons in Calinch because, of course, with Wentworth having been a sailor, and he is part of the Blue Order who's able to hear dragons, because basically all my Austen heroes and heroines are, because it makes the stories far more interesting. Although we're playing with some ideas to change that a little bit. Mike didn't like the Sanditon ending of the series. I actually haven't watched that series yet. I've had so many things cooking creatively that I thought, okay, I will hold off on that until I get some of these other ideas out of the way, because one of the challenging things as a writer in general, and for me, particularly in this fantasy world, that I love spending time in this world. It's my favorite place to be, is the shiny bunny syndrome. Oh, look, there's a shiny one. Oh, there's another one. And yeah, that's exactly what happens. I get chasing up. Oh, look at that one. Oh, look at that one. So I have a file. Yes, shiny squirrels, lots of shiny squirrels. In this case, there's shiny fairy dragons and tassel worms. And oh, there's another dragon myth I don't know anything about. Let me go chase this one up. And oh, that piece of research. Yeah, I've heard of that completion of Sanditon too, Brenda. I haven't read that one yet. It's on the long list of things to do. But I actually have a file where I keep random ideas like that, and even random pieces of research that, oh, that's got to go in a story someday. Like I came across an article, and I come across a lot of articles here and there just because I seem to find them. I'm not sure why, but came across an article on a shipwreck that the ship went down not far from the coast of England carrying gold, and it hasn't been found today. And I thought, oh my goodness, what can I do with that? That just seems to be begging to be made into a story point. And I have found a good place to use it. So there's nothing more fun than finding tidbits of research that can be worked into the plot lines and just add that little bit extra of realism into the fantasy world. I can't tell you, all I can tell you is you've got to read Calinch Dragon Persuasion, because that's a spoiler that will ruin too much of the book. I can't share that with you yet. The book is coming out on the 9th of July, so that's just a little bit over a week. And I got to ask you to wait till then, because I would love to be able to share it, but that is just a huge spoiler. The book will be on Kindle Unlimited. It'll probably be about 90 days before I put it on Kindle Unlimited. I will be putting the prequel to it, Dragons of Calinch, on Kindle Unlimited in the next few days. So just before the second book comes out, I'll have the first one on Kindle Unlimited. And then about 90 days after that, I'll move the second one into Kindle Unlimited. Brenda asks about the manuscript not totally finished. The manuscript is finished. I just have to add the final edits onto the epilogue. So right now, my poor manuscript, the first half of it is completely proofread and ready to go. The second half is going through 3 levels of proofreading, because I am a terrible proofreader, and sometimes I add mistakes in as I'm proofing. And so I have proofreaders help me, and then I fix things, and I have another proofreader to proofread what I proofread because it's just not my strong suit. So the second half of the book is going through that, and I just have to do the last edits on the epilogue and get that into the proofreader. So really it's done. It's just a couple hundred words of editing that I need to finish. So it's nearly finished. Ben asked about the audiobook in September for Kalinch Dragon Persuasion. Put it on the calendar. Let's do it. Because I would definitely like to have that to be able to promise people soon, because as soon as I start talking about dragons, the next thing is, when is the audio going to be out? The audio and the paperback is what everybody asks about, and yes, there will be both. As soon as I get the ebook out for Kalinch, I will get paperbacks out for both both books of the Persuasion arc, and we will have audiobooks for both of those. Because they're just so much fun. We need to do that. Do I do the ebooks myself, or does someone else do that for me? Yeah, I do them. I'm a quintessential do-it-yourselfer, and I like to have my hands in those things. With a lot of the new tools out, doing the ebooks yourself is not nearly as difficult as it used to be. So I do get those done. What about the hypothetical 5-book science fiction series? Yeah, it's not hypothetical, it's 6 books now. But yeah, that's actually, I'm going to be starting on that as soon as I hit the publish button on Kalinch. I'll be dividing my time between these projects and that, because if I don't, my husband and sons will kill me. So I will be, yeah, I'm very busy. Yes, Betty, pick you, definitely. What sort of science fiction project? It is, okay, it's been cooking for probably about 7 years, and it was actually inspired by Austen in its own way. In fact, it's a story about multiple cultures and how they kind of deal with each other, but in terms of people. And one of those cultures is very much built off of Georgian and Regency England, and looking at class divides there. And definitely a number of the characters have had inspiration from Austen. Now, it leaps so far away from Austen, I really, I can't get away with saying that they are Austen inspired, because it's, you know, several levels removed from it. But they are much more character-based than gadget-based, if that makes any sense for those of you who do venture into the science fiction realm. There's some science fiction that's very gadget and technology-oriented. Am I going to publish it under Maria Grace? Right now, I think so. I've been doing a lot of research about what to do in that realm, but I think I probably will. And I'll keep everybody up to date on those projects as well on the website. Basically, anything that I'm doing, anything that's even remotely interesting, you can find on the website. And I do have the subscription for the Dragon newsletter on there in the sidebar. And then my Not Dragon newsletter is also on there. That I try to keep everybody abreast of what projects are going and when they're going to publish. I've got a lot of the Regency era research, so if there's any talks that you've heard me do or articles that you've seen from me elsewhere, they're all also going to be resident on the website, and you can find them there. And if nothing else, there's a contact form you can use to get in touch with me. So I don't want to make anything difficult to find or to uncover. We've got about 2 minutes left, so any last questions, thoughts, hopes, wishes, dreams? I do take suggestions. A number of you who have talked to me are at risk. You know, that just gave me a good idea. Expect to see it a few books down the line. So, yeah, I always love to listen to ideas and thoughts and inspirations, and questions are always great, because get a lot of good ideas from those. Yeah, I'm looking forward to a whole lot more dragon books. Oh, Pemberley hosting the Westminster Dog Show. Little Pemberley has a thing for puppies. There's a lot of humor running through these books, and one of the bits of humor is little baby Pemberley Dragon is lonely, and so she has a dog. In fact, she has 2 dogs, and so she hangs around with her puppies. Hey, Chris, it's good to see you too, and I'm looking forward to working on that as well. How are my dragon books compared to my non-fantasy Jaff? Well, as was discussed in the trope conversation yesterday, fantasy is not the most popular Jaff trope out there. So they're certainly not going to be as popular as a lot of the more traditional romances, but there is definitely a strong core of people who like their Austen with dragons. So it's enough that it's thanks, Ben. It's certainly enough to make it worth doing. So I will definitely keep at it as long as there are people reading it. But with that, I think I am out of time. So I need to pass this over to Jack, who is going to be telling us about Jane Austen's Fighting Men, which I am personally looking forward to hearing about. So let me get Jack on. Okay, Jack, there you go. I am going to make you host here, Jack.
Okay, am I in? No,
Yes, you are in.